Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Nick Halaris Show. Our guest this week is Yuen Chan, the COO of Phoenix Waste Solutions. Yuen, welcome to the show.
Hi, Nick. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for being here. This is not something I get to say very often, but I've been thinking about it all morning, which is we're here to talk about garbage.
Yes, this is going to be a garbage show. Yes.
Exactly. Well, thanks for being here. I came across your company, I forget where, but in one of the many sort of newsletters that I read and was so fascinated by it that reached out to you and you graciously kind of took my cold email and call. And now here we are a few months later recording this. So thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, I figured a good place to start is just the whole garbage world. This is a topic that most people don't really think about, but today here where I live in West Hollywood, it's garbage day. So I was thinking about it. And I guess, why don't we just talk about, you know, what's going on in the garbage ecosystem in the United States and across the world, and why is this such a big issue?
Well, as you said, people just like to throw their garbage away, right? And the thing is, it never really goes away. I mean, to the point of 2.1 billion tons of waste every year gets thrown away, and people just don't want to know what happens after, with that. But most of it goes into landfills, especially in the United States. It's landfills are relatively cheap. Um, and landfills, if landfills were a country, it would be the third biggest cause of carbon emissions in the world, right? Landfills produce so much methane. They're even called super emitter landfills. They produce more methane than all of agriculture and all of aviation put together. So if we talk about the climate crisis, a big cause of the climate crisis is actually the garbage crisis.
Wow. Okay. So essentially, what happens with these landfills is the pressure, the combination of the pressure of this stuff being packed underground causes a chemical reaction that reduces methane, which is the same thing that like the beef industry gets gets in trouble for, right? Or gets criticized for.
Exactly. I mean, when food waste goes into the landfill. If it's because it's a non-oxygenated environment, it actually produces methane, and methane is actually 23 times more potent than CO2 as a greenhouse gas. So it's a huge cause of climate change.
Yeah. And the number that you referenced, like the 2.1 billion ton number, give me a sense for how big that is. Like, how big of a landfill does that fit into? I'm trying to just get a sense of the scale.
Well, I think if we think about our personal responsibility, right? So they estimate that in United States, every person produces 4.5 pounds of garbage per day, right? The rest of the world produces about 2 pounds of garbage per day, but United States, well, we're special, so we produce 4.5 pounds per person per day. So if you think about that, if you put that in a one square foot space, in 1 year, every person produces, that'd be 19 stories, like a 19-story building. That's how much garbage one person produces in 1 year. And the thing is, every one of us, we're producing more and more garbage. So between the 1980s and now, 40 years, a generation, we are producing 75% more garbage than we did before, because each generation produces more and more garbage. When I think about it, when my mom, when I was growing up, my mom produced way less garbage, and my grandma produced hardly any garbage. I mean, she would like, oh, I have to throw away this. Is that possible? And it was a matter of pride, right? She would make her own clothes, and that the leftover from the cloth, it wouldn't be more than the palm of her hand, right? That's how little garbage that she produced, that my grandma produced. And every generation, we're just producing more and more. I mean, I bought something from Amazon, and the amount of packaging is like 3 times the volume of that item of clothing that I bought.
Right. Yeah. So it's just like as we became more and more consumer focused, and these, Amazon Prime's amazing in the sense that you can get whatever you want by pressing buttons on your computer, but there's a environmental cost, obviously, to this kind of living.
Exactly. And I mean, 50% of the waste that ends up in landfills is actually just packaging. So if you think about it, it doesn't add to the value of the goods at all. It's just packaging, right? And it's because of our complex supply chain, and we want things to arrive pretty, and there's the whole unboxing phenomena. So it's for that little dopamine hit that we get by unboxing our little package. We're causing just enormous amounts of wastage, enormous amount of resources, just going into something that doesn't add value at all.
Right. And when you throw something in, let's say you throw something in the trash, like an Amazon package, and it ends up as part of this 2.1 billion tons, how long does it sit underground before it starts to like decompose? Like how does that process work?
Well, I think that's the whole point about landfills. It hardly decomposes. So I was reading this book about landfills, and they did this excavation work. So they were like excavating this landfill, and they got to this part of the landfill. They actually put that was dumped in the landfill in the 1960s, and they know this because they actually, part of it was this newspaper, and they could read the print on the newspaper, and they could see the date. 1962. And there was this green stuff on that piece of newspaper, and you know what it was? It was guacamole. So
Wow.
the guacamole didn't even change color, right? It's such a way to preserve, landfills just preserve garbage forever.
Wow. So the process of is decades and decades in the making before something turns in. So when you see a landfill like in America now, how deep below the surface is the trash? Is it just right there at the surface and it goes down for hundreds of feet, or like what does it look like?
I'm afraid I don't really know, because I don't really know about the construction of
Okay.
landfills. I know that they're lined, but I think, one of the things about garbage, and particularly plastic lasting forever, is when stuff escapes the landfill, right? And when garbage escapes the landfill, like for example, like when plastic escapes the landfills or dumps and ends up in the sea. So 50%, sorry, what was it? 80% of marine litter is actually plastic, and that lasts forever because it's plastic. It just stays there forever, right? It doesn't. If you think about it, every piece of plastic that was ever made still exists today. I mean, the big explosion of plastics was in the 1950s, 1960s. And, certainly, plastic from that era is still around today.
Yeah, that's right. I was actually just recently at a wedding in Hawaii with, and the person I sat next to, his family, they worked for the Coast Guard, and they were telling me that they've been out to that Pacific plastic thing that's in
The
the middle of
garbage patch, yeah.
the garbage patch in the middle of the ocean, and said it's astonishing. And there's ways to clean it up. I think that the most disheartening part of that conversation was they're telling me that it's actually there's a lot of ways to clean it up, but we're just not spending the money on it. Like we could actually clean that whole thing up if we just put the
The
financial
resources.
resources to do it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And
Yeah.
if you think about a piece of plastic, right, a plastic bag, the average use of a grocery plastic bag is 15 minutes. Now, if it ends up in the sea, a turtle, it looks like a jellyfish, so a turtle will eat it, swallow it, and it can actually kill 7 marine animals because the turtle ingests that plastic. It binds up their organs. They actually starve to death in the most horrific, slow, horrible way. Their stomachs are, there are all these pictures of these fish and this marine life. Their stomachs are just full of plastic, and they actually starve to death because it just binds up their organs. And then the animal dies, and then the plastic is let loose again, only to be ingested by another animal. So if you think about it, that one plastic bag can kill up to 7 marine animals before it becomes so small as a microplastic. Then it kills in other ways, right?
Right.
The shrimp that ingested, they find that shrimp have microplastic inside them. It's actually horrifying. Our sea salt, as most of our sea salt actually has microplastics in it. So if we think we're the top of the food chain, well, all that microplastic is going somewhere, which is us.
Yeah. We're definitely, yeah. And there's been like a bunch of crazy articles about it recently, actually. about it
Yes,
showing up in like male sexual organs and stuff like that. Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
yes.
So question on the Great Pacific plastic patch. How much of that is coming from the United States? I'm sure it's like impossible to tell, but like obviously the US is producing more garbage per capita than anyone else, but do we have a sense of where this stuff is coming from?
I read this statistic that that most of the marine plastic actually comes from like 10, like something like 80% of it comes from 10 rivers, and
Okay.
most of those rivers are actually in Asia. Um, and so while we kind of talk about how bad landfills are, and the amount of methane that they cause. So imagine in countries where there is no waste infrastructure, countries like Nepal or Indonesia or Malaysia, or these different, many countries which don't have waste infrastructure, or the infrastructure is very limited to cities, but the countryside or the smaller towns don't have waste infrastructure.
Yep. So yeah, those places obviously like the situation is worse, but in it for different reasons because there's just trash everywhere.
Yes, yes. I'm originally from Malaysia, and in Malaysia there is good trash collection in the cities, but once you get to the rural areas, there's no trash collection. People just dig a hole in the garden and chuck their trash in, or throw it in the river, and then it goes away, right?
I see.
And that was fine when they were wrapping stuff in banana leaves, or biodegradable materials. But the more and more plastic there is nowadays, then it's not fine anymore.
Yep. One more question about trash before we move to recycling, because I feel like we should talk about that. Why is it in the United States that all the cities are like dominated by one trash company? Is that something that you've ever like looked into?
Well, I do think that when we talk about like big monopolistic kind of companies, I think the big trash companies have actually have a lot of power. It's a great contract to get, right? If you're doing the trash collection for a city, and usually these contracts are for a long time, 20, 30 years. And So I think I was reading another statistic where the smaller landfills, like the family-owned landfills, or the smaller ones, they've actually reduced in the last 4 or 5 years. They've actually reduced by about 25%. They're kind of getting bought out by these massive waste companies, that do tend to dominate the waste management business in the United States.
Yeah, it seems like there's like basically one or two of them, right? It's like I forget that it's waste management, obviously, and then there was one. But even here in LA, like LA County is a behemoth place, and there's only one trash company.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, and it almost doesn't make sense because we have more than one police force. We have the sheriff and we have the LAPD, but there's only one trash company, which is kind of interesting.
Yes, and that's leading to bigger and bigger, more centralized waste collection and waste management, um, and I think the bigger it's just leading to much more transportation in waste. I think 20, 30 years ago the waste management landscape was like smaller scale landfills, smaller scale dumps, where it was a bit more decentralized. It's just getting to be much more of a centralized system, where basically we're just burning a lot more fossil fuels, transporting waste to these very huge, gigantic, enormous landfills.
Yep. And those those mega landfills like that, are they is there ever a moment in time where you could do something else with them? Like could you build houses on them or is it just like wasteland once you do that?
I believe it's gone forever, right? For generations,
Yeah.
I mean, forever. You know, that there's the cost of building the landfill, and then there's the cost of also shutting down the landfill. Um, yeah.
Yeah. What about recycling? Like how good of a job? Like we all have our recycling bins and this has been I remember as a kid actually the recycling movement making its way into the elementary school. Like there was a woman who came to our song or I mean, came to our school and sang a song about recycling that I still kind of remember, which is funny. Um, is it working? How much percentage of the stuff of the waste are we recycling? Like, what's your take on that?
Well, I think there's a good link between recycling and what we're talking about, right? These waste monopolies. Um, so actually, in the United States, in the 80s and 90s, we recycle a lot more. We recycled something like 50% more. There was 50% more recycling than than now, and that's because of single stream recycling. So there were actually lobbies that actually lobbied the government to say, hey, let's make recycling easier and we'll call it single stream recycling. So people just need to put all their recycling in this one bin, right? And we'll pick it up for you and that's it. And what that has actually done is actually that has actually reduced the amount of materials that can be recycled because there are all these people, they call them hopeful recyclers. We're like, oh, okay, I've got this pizza box. Well, it's got cheese in it and half a pizza, but well, I think the paper can be recycled. So let's try anyway. And then that one pizza box with, half a pizza in it ends up contaminating the whole bin of recyclable paper because of that one piece of half a pizza, right? And those hopeful recyclers are actually destroying recycling. And partly that's personal responsibility, that's lack of understanding, that's lack of personal accountability. But also there is also an element where people have been enticed into that, like, hey, just put all your recycling in this one bin. And that leads people to be more hopeful, right, than they really should
Yeah.
be.
Okay, so that in that example, like let's say you throw you're the person who throws the pizza into the blue bin. Who makes the determination that it's contaminated, and then what happens to it? Does it just go to the landfill? Like, do you know exactly how that process plays out?
Yes. So recycling is actually, I mean, recycling does work. People do, they actually, recycle paper and plastic and glass and metal and all of that. Um, but since the single stream recycling was lobbied for and implemented, actually the amount of the percentage of recycling that ends up in the landfill is actually higher and higher by quite a lot. There's some arguments made that it was actually the landfill companies who now actually are in the recycling business who have actually lobbied for this single stream recycling because it actually gives them more business on the landfill side of things. And we have to remember that that recycling is actually very price sensitive. Like if someone is selling recycled paper or recycled plastic, they have to compete with the price of virgin plastic or paper, right? So it's very, very price sensitive. So sometimes recycling makes money and sometimes it doesn't. And when it doesn't, then you just get this big stockpile of plastic or paper. Right? So the less sorting that the people who actually recycle paper or plastic, the less sorting they have to do, the better their margins, the more competitive that their material can be.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So, what were they doing before, like before the single stream?
I believe they had like different. You had to like put your brown bottles in one thing, clear
Got it.
bottles, green bottles, even glass, like three buckets, right? Paper had brown and white paper and newsprint and other types of paper. So it required more work up front. But if you just end up putting it in one bin, well, some minimal wage worker, most often a woman, has to be there sorting out that garbage, right? It has to be done by someone.
Right. I read just this morning. It's funny how timing works out. I'm just pulling it up on my phone because I want to get it right. But there was some update about a company. I think it might be Amazon, but let me just confirm. A company using AI to sort trash. Um, anyways, I don't have it handy, but anyways, I thought it was interesting. I saw it come across my screen this morning, and I'm not sure how they're doing it and how the AI is sorting the trash, but that could be, maybe that will help some of this.
Yeah, I've seen these prototypes for these smart garbage bins, right? And they're supposed to like separate out garbage, but it's kind of, I don't know. It's, I think AI is a great thing to have. But how dumb do we have to be for us to need a smart garbage bin to say, put plastic here and put glass here and put paper here, right? I mean, how dumb do we have to be to need a smart bin?
That's a fair point. Very fair point. Yeah, you mentioned the price sensitivity. I have a little bit of experience with this in the metals field. Like for a very brief period of time, I worked for a metals recycling company, and that was an industry that was fascinating because in that supply chain, because of the value of metal, almost nothing gets wasted. Like everything you could possibly think of that has metal in it would show up at our facilities, whether it's an old bicycle or whatever. Obviously there's easy examples like cans and stuff that people can recycle, but every single piece of metal got recycled. Even cars, like we had at one of our facilities, we had this giant shredder machine where you take a car basically and put it through this machine and it would just destroy it, rip it all to shreds, and then they would sort the metal by weight, but it all got reused. And it seems like there's other places where if you had that sorting done and there was a financial incentive for it, you could probably recycle almost anything that wasn't biodegradable, right?
Yes, and particularly like metal and glass in the recycling world, metal and glass can be recycled infinitely. Whereas paper and plastic, because of the fibers in them, they get shortened each time. And every time you recycle paper or plastic, it actually gets downcycled. You have to do, a lower quality paper or plastic. Whereas metal and glass can be recycled endlessly. And that's interesting about the can that you showed, because I was reading this a book as well, and it talked about how in some less developed countries, they just look at us like, why are you drinking that sugary water and throwing away the can when the can's the more valuable part of it, right?
Right. That's for sure. And this doesn't even have like this one in particular has no calories. It's just like soda water. Yeah. It's completely worthless essentially. Yeah. Um, okay. So recycling is working, but maybe not as good as it used to. What about overseas, right? You mentioned that there's like these 10 rivers in Asia that are contributing to the bulk of the marine litter. Are these same Asian places good at recycling or bad, or what's the prognosis?
Mm. Well, I think at one in around 2020, everyone was horrified at all the waste ending up in certain countries, countries like Malaysia. It was all in the news in Malaysia because China stopped accepting waste plastic, right? Or actually, they didn't stop accepting waste plastic. They were more um, stringent about the quality of plastic, right? So it could only have like 1% contamination, which made it practically impossible. So basically, it ended up in countries like Malaysia or Indonesia, where it was essentially just dumped. So I think those countries, I know certainly like in Malaysia, there are recycling companies that do recycle, paper and stuff. But basically, they're just overwhelmed by the amount of plastic that gets dumped in those countries.
Yeah, I've seen some stuff too, some like photographs of places in Africa where they have like all these computer things and like clothes. Or I've seen several different versions of that where it's either like refuse from the fashion industry or from the electronics industry, and it ends up obviously it doesn't end up in California. It ends up someplace really, really far away. And I even saw these phenomenal photos just recently. I wish I would remember the photographer's name, but it was again someplace in Asia, and it's the place where all the ships that people have, these giant container ships, where they go to die and be cut up and recycled. And it's like it looks like a Mad Max kind of wasteland where they put
Yes.
these ships.
Yes. Yeah,
Yes.
I think I know the one that you're talking about the clothing industry, right? Like in Chile, there's this
Yeah.
mountain of discarded clothing that can be seen from space, and that not only is that just waste in their country, it's also decimated their local textile industry because of all these cheap imports.
Yeah, because it could be used. Getting back to the methane discussion that we were having about the landfills, are things like let's say clothing ends up in the landfill. Is that like a high methane producing item, or what is actually producing that methane amongst all the things we
So the
we throw in the trash?
most of methane is actually from organic materials, right? So food
Okay.
waste or yard waste and all of that. Um, there is some discussion, if I can remember correctly, there is some discussion about plastics when plastics actually break down. There is some gas release from that. Um, but the big one obviously is from the organic waste.
Yeah, got it. How did you get into garbage to begin with? I'd love to hear that story.
Well, like I mentioned, I am from Malaysia, and I still have a adventure tourism company in Malaysia, and we do whitewater rafting and caving and outdoor programs there. And we've been in this beautiful area in rural Malaysia for over 20 years. And as the company became more and more successful, I realized that I had inadvertently caused a garbage issue. And that's why I know very clearly that in rural areas in Malaysia, I mean, the cities are fantastic. The cities have these, very modern waste infrastructure, right? Well, fantastic inverted commas, right? So it goes to these, big line landfills and all of that. But in the village, once you get out of the cities, uh, you know, people literally just throw rubbish in the rivers. I've been kayaking, and a plastic bag of waste has flown over my head, and like, oh, thanks, thanks for not
Yeah.
hitting me. Um, um, and so basically, kind of looking at that whole garbage issue, and then as a company, we had enough resources to send that waste to the landfill. But I started investigating more and more about this, right? So, like, is landfill great? You can send it to the landfill. Yay, my responsibility is over. And then I started looking at it. Well, actually, no. Actually, the problems are just kind of starting. It's really the whole way waste is being managed. Um, and my partner is an engineer, and she recently retired. She had recently retired, and so I asked her to look at this problem. And what she came up with was a way of a small scale waste incinerator that doesn't use any fuel, that doesn't use any fossil fuel. And because it doesn't use any fossil fuel, and because the process is called low temperature plasma assisted combustion, what a mouthful, it actually produces 50% less CO2 than a conventional incinerator. So it's a way of disposing of waste. It's a way of taking that waste disposal capabilities and putting it in the hands of people who produce waste, instead of putting them in this long chain of which ends up in landfills, right? Um, so it's deliberately designed small so that people who produce waste can dispose of their waste at their site. And we can dispose of waste through this process. It produces 50% less CO2 than a conventional incinerator, and 25% of the greenhouse gas equivalent of landfills. So it's actually better for the environment than landfills.
Interesting. And yeah, I guess I should have asked this earlier when we were talking about garbage, but presumably for most of human history, that's what we did with garbage, right? We just burned it.
Yeah, burned it or buried it, right?
Burned it, yeah.
And yeah, I mean, or left it lying around. So when it was managed, for the last 150 years, ever since landfills and garbage dumps and burning garbage has been around, that hasn't changed. But so what our plasma assisted combustion does, it basically is a way of burning that is cleaner and more efficient. It's hotter and cleaner, right? And this plasma assisted combustion has been looked at by Princeton University, and different labs have looked at this, mainly in the field of combustion engines. But what we have is a patent that's the first application of this plasma assisted combustion in the field of waste management. And so, we produce less CO2, and it allows for a decentralized waste management system where, instead of having hundreds of garbage trucks, creating lots of emissions as well as they collect waste, You can have a decentralized waste management system where, it's a distributed way of managing waste instead of a highly centralized way.
Right, because like you mentioned earlier, part of the problem with our system is that we're transporting this stuff all around, which has its own sort of carbon footprint.
Exactly. And if you think about it, garbage trucks are the most fuel inefficient vehicles on the road, right? They're huge, they're big, they keep starting and stopping. They get 5 miles per gallon, right? It's the worst fuel efficiency of any vehicle on the road by far.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so what got you interested was you're in Malaysia doing your tours and almost getting hit by garbage on the kayak. Um, how much, like, you just noticed it accumulating? Like, you'd notice plastic in the rivers and stuff like that. How long was this process for you of kind of seeing what was happening with your business?
Well, as we develop our tourism industry in this area, there were the area started getting more populated, right? There's more employment, there are more visitors coming, and I literally one day, maybe like 15 years in, I was cycling one day and I was like, I turned a corner in the jungle and saw this pit full of garbage, and I was like, wait a minute. And it was all plastic bottles. It was all stuff from the tourists, right? It wasn't from the locals living there. It was all trash from tourists.
Yeah,
And I realized that's when it really hit me. It's like, wow, I can't blame anyone else. It's my industry that has created this.
that's doing that.
Um,
Okay.
and because of that, I started looking at this way of how do we dispose of garbage, how can we actually look at a more efficient way, and then just became fascinated by this by the whole topic.
Yeah, absolutely. So when it comes to, like, let's talk for a second about the old way of doing incinerating trash. What is bad about it besides the carbon? I thought the story there was that it's carbon intensive, or it produces a lot of carbon, and it's costly to do it, and it also releases like nasty toxins in the air.
Well, I think waste incinerators definitely at one time were quite toxic, right? They had
Okay.
they had bad emissions control. I think now the modern waste incinerators are actually they do go through stringent tests. Particularly like in Europe, that's the main way of getting rid of garbage. Incineration is they don't have space for landfills in Europe, right? So in Europe, the incineration technology is actually very advanced. And so they have all these different ways of, filtering the air, the emissions that come off from the incineration. Um, uh, I'm not quite sure about the large scale incinerators, but I can certainly speak to the small scale incinerators because I've done some research about that. So there was a University of Texas study that looked at small scale incinerators that incinerate between 1 to 5-6 tons of waste per day, and on average, to dispose of 5 tons of waste, they would use something like 800 gallons of diesel per day to dispose of 5 tons of waste, which is a huge amount of fossil fuels. And our invention basically uses zero fuel. It doesn't use any fossil fuels at all. So 800 gallons of diesel or zero, right? Your operating costs are much lower,
That,
hugely lower.
yeah, wow. So how does the plasma, without getting too technical, because this my audience is definitely not a technical audience, how does this plasma thing heat up and
Yep.
produce enough temperature and pressure to get rid of the waste?
So our secret invention is an ionizer, and what we do is we basically take atmospheric air, just normal air from the environment. We suck it through. We have some pumps and blowers, and we suck it from the air and push it into the furnace, and we push it through our ionizer. And what the ionizer does is that it decouples the oxygen molecules. So oxygen is O2. It forms a molecule, and by breaking apart that molecule, we have atomic oxygen. I love the term atomic oxygen. That's our superpower, right? It sounds like a Marvel Comics superpower. So that atomic oxygen, that's what the atomic oxygen and the free electrons that are circulating, that's what creates the immense energy So we see temperatures in the furnace of up to like between 1,200 to 2,000 Fahrenheit, and that burns off a lot of the furans and the dioxins and the toxic fumes that come off when you burn garbage because of that intense high heat. And because of that high heat, we have about 1% ash. Whatever waste we put in is reduced to about 1% ash. So we have a very complete combustion process. A typical incinerator would produce up to like 10% ash. So that their process isn't such a complete combustion process. And the cool thing about atomic oxygen, apart from producing this high intense heat, is that the oxygen molecule isn't available for the pollutants to form. So if you go to our website and there's a video there, there's this picture of Tammy one evening, and she's turning on the ion generator, and there's smoke coming out from the furnace. And literally, when she turns on the ionizer, that smoke it just goes away. It just doesn't form. And because we don't have that oxygen molecule to form the pollutants. So for example, let's say in United States, the limit on incinerators for furans and dioxins. So furans and dioxins are the part of the chemicals that are potentially cancer causing, right? So the limit on that is 33 parts, 33 nano something or other, 33 parts per cubic meter. And our machine only produces 0.1 nanograms. So it's, 300 times more efficient of getting rid of that furans and dioxins because of that atomic oxygen.
Interesting. And sort of the main difference is that those cancer causing elements need to bind to oxygen essentially to get out
O2.
and to spread out into the world. Wow.
Yes.
And the ash part, like going back to a regular incinerator, what happens to that ash in the current supply chain?
Actually, ash from incinerators are actually quite highly valued because they actually make bricks from it. They can make bricks or pavers, you can actually make bricks using 80% less concrete. And actually, concrete, cement and sand are actually cement is a very carbon intensive material, right? That it's produced from limestone. It's very, very carbon intensive. So if you can make bricks using 80% less concrete, that's a winner, I think. And you're making bricks from trash.
And that's so is that the primary use of ash from incinerators today?
I'm not sure about the general incinerators, but there's certainly, in our the Phoenix, the machine that we've invented, we call it the Phoenix. That's what we're advocating, that people take that ash and they actually upcycle it into bricks.
Into brick. Okay. And so the ash itself, like from your machine, is it safe enough where you can just touch it with like your hand, or do you need special equipment to deal with that kind of stuff?
Yeah, so we've done a T-clip analysis of it and looked at the chemical content. So it has no heavy metals. So it's actually safe for use. It can actually be put into soil, right? It passed the T-clip analysis. It's not considered hazardous waste. So I can't, certainly from our Phoenix, we've done the analysis of it. We obviously haven't done the analysis of every single possible types of waste that can go in. But from normal household waste, we've done a couple of different sampling of the different of the ash, and it passes the toxicity tests.
Okay, great. And could you use the Phoenix to, let's take plastic? What happens if you put plastic in the Phoenix?
It goes away, right?
Okay.
It basically gets converted into that 1% ash. I've put in a whole TV set, for example. I put in a whole TV set, a printer, some old electronics that we have. And basically what happens is that the plastic all disappears. And the steel circuit board, I can retrieve that for recycling.
Okay, so at the bottom of the tank, any of the metal stuff will still be there.
Exactly.
That's really cool. And you were mentioning earlier before we hit the record button that there's some like pretty high powered people interested in your technology, like the American Department of Defense. What can you tell me about that conversation?
Well, I think the U.S. Department of Defense, they've recognized the problem of burn pits, um, and veterans have been getting sick from burn
Yeah.
pits, and basically the U.S. Military, um, the way they've been disposing of garbage hasn't really changed from, I don't know, the Romans, which is burning their waste. um, and Obviously you can't let it go into a landfill, or can't let the enemy get hold of it, because there's a lot of intelligence in garbage, right? You can understand everything about a society or group of people by looking at their garbage. So they've been just setting it on fire and causing huge health problems among veterans. And recently, with the CARES Act, they've been looking at, finally, that burn pits have been made illegal, and veterans are getting the care that they need for their burn pit injuries, or the illnesses they've had, they've contracted as a result of burn pits. And finally, the U.S. Department of Defense is looking at ways to get rid of the garbage.
Yeah, totally. Well, that could be interesting. And so, I guess the other thing which we didn't touch on, but my understanding of the Phoenix is that it's potentially of a size where it could be distributed, maybe even at the level of a home, right? Tell me more about that.
Currently, the prototype that we've been working at, it fits into a container. Fits into a 20-foot container, and we designed it so that it would be easily transportable. So one of the things that we are looking at in our R&D is how do we scale it to smaller and smaller sizes. Um, you know, yeah.
Yeah, because like in your vision, is it like let's say you could build a machine like yours and have it be as big as like my three cans. I've got my trash can, my biodegradable can, food waste can, and my recycling can. Is it better for us to like put everything through the Phoenix except for obviously the things that are obviously recyclable, like aluminum cans and whatnot? Or what's your take on sort of the overall vision for it in the best case scenario?
Well, the overall vision for it is that it's a micro waste to energy furnace, right? That you actually recover from the heat that you generate. We actually recover energy from that. People have been making electricity from steam, for 100 over years, right? So that technology exists. So if we're creating energy from that waste, we should harness it into producing electricity, or even heating hot water. They can heat your house. Um, so that's part of our R&D in this phase of development. We're actually looking at how do we connect up and do the energy generation portion. Obviously, so there's a certain scalability. If you want to recover energy from it, that it has to scale to a certain minimum size. So if you have a bag of garbage, well, you're not going to be able to generate that much consistent electricity from that. So a certain amount of communal cooperation would be good, so that you can actually keep that uh, the energy recovery
Yeah.
working. But I think you had the right idea, because you talked about recycling. So there's this thing called the waste hierarchy, right? And I think we have to bear that in mind. The waste hierarchy at the very top is that you reduce, right? You don't make any waste. You follow my grandma and produce this amount of waste that you can hold in your hand. Then you recycle, and then only you dispose of it, right? And if you can actually um, recover energy before actually just final disposal without energy recovery, that's actually above just disposing of waste. So following
Right.
that hierarchy of not producing any waste, reducing it, recycling it, recovering energy from it, and then finally, well, I just think, to be realistic, there is always some waste that you cannot do anything with.
Yeah, but it seems like with the advances like your Phoenix and maybe some more a different policy approach when it comes to recycling and a mindset around consumption, like we actually could do some real damage in making it a better world as far as this, trash and the footprint that we're leaving on the world. Doesn't
Absolutely. And I think, personally, I think garbage is one thing that we can control a little bit, right? It's hard to like, you know, it's hard to give up that, it's getting on an aeroplane and flying to your family reunion. How do you stop those carbon emissions that way? But that personal responsibility about how much garbage you create is something that we can each affect in our own lives in a very real way. Today, right? You can start today.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's an area of life where you could have immediate impact right now, which is
Yes.
exciting. Yeah,
Yeah.
and it's critical. Like I love what you're working on, what you guys are working on, because if you start to think about what does a world look like if everyone else is consuming at the level that America is consuming at, whether it's things like the meat industry or even just Amazon style consumption, just garbage, right? Like not real garbage, but like things you don't really need in your house, but you buy because they're incredibly cheap. Um, Imagine if everyone on Earth has that kind of access to consumer items. We'd really have a trash problem if we don't get out in front of it with technologies like yours.
Yeah. I mean, imagine like, let's say you came whitewater rafting at my company, right? You came whitewater rafting, and then you say, okay, here's your helmet, here's your life jacket. And okay, we're going to go on this whitewater rafting trip. And after this whitewater rafting trip, just put it in the garbage bin over there. You think like, oh my God, these people like use once, like a life jacket that you use once, a helmet that you use once. That's crazy. But, we do that all the time with, paper cups, with plastic bottles, and we don't even think about it, right? We don't even think about how much single use there is in our life in things that weren't before. I mean, when I was growing up, my mom every year at the start of school, she'd take me out and buy a water bottle and say, be really careful, make sure that this water bottle lasts you for the whole year. And now we just buy things in bottles all the time and just throw them away all the time without even thinking about it. And it's only when we have a very outlandish example, use this life jacket once and never again, then we're like, whoa, wait a minute, that's so wasteful. But we do it all, think about our lives. There's like 10 things that we do that, right?
Yeah,
Without even thinking.
I know. Even what you mentioned earlier, like the 4 pounds of trash, or what is that the number? 4 pounds of trash per day?
4.5.
4.5. Yeah, that's wild. This is a lot of garbage. But I was thinking about what my mornings look like, and like I'm on my way, right? I've had I've had one of these drinks. I've had some coffee. I had a banana. Like it's starting to add up, right? All the stuff. So
Yeah, and it's the whole supply chain, right? I mean, do you remember the time when like soda came in bottles and then you'd return it for like a nickel? And
yeah,
that was how it used to be, right? It used to be, we talk about how we make money as kids, right? Going collecting all these bottles
yeah,
and going back to the shop.
totally.
No one does that anymore.
Yeah, it doesn't seem that. I remember doing that, and it was a lot of work, but you would get like $10 at the end of it, and it was worth it. It was worth it. Yeah.
Yeah, and it was how it was, and now we don't even question the amount of packaging that we have, the amount of things that just end up ridiculously packaged.
Yeah, crazy. Well, Yoon, this has been a fascinating conversation. I'm really excited about Phoenix. Tell me where is Phoenix in its life cycle as a company? You got your prototype. It sounds like you've got your intellectual property secured. Like what's the plan? Are you trying to raise venture funds? What are you trying to do?
Currently, we're at the last stage of our R&D and getting into pilots. So we've got a pilot. We've got one pilot lined up at a port, getting rid of waste from ports. And we want to get a few more pilots under our belt and get that feedback. Getting it used in a proper waste management situation, getting that feedback to come up with our commercial model. So we are, maybe about a year away from having our product ready to be commercialized. But at the moment, we're looking for people who have trash to run pilots with.
Nice.
So
Okay.
yeah,
Well, there's no shortage of that apparently. So I'm sure you'll find plenty of people with trash to get rid of.
yes. Thank you so much. Yeah,
Yeah,
if anyone wants to get in touch with us, where our website is up, you can contact us through our website. Yeah.
excellent. Yeah, and I'll make sure that when we send out this episode, everyone has links to Phoenix and knows how to get in touch with you. So thank you so
Yes.
much for taking the time today, and I'll look forward to seeing how the next year goes and what happens with Phoenix.
Yes. Great trash talk, Nick.
Likewise, yeah, enjoyed it.
All right. Thank